Ryan stood completely frozen in place. His 3 sons were laughing out loud, soaking wet inside his kitchen sink. Her hands were in the water, and in that 1 second everything he thought he had under control completely shattered into a million pieces. Ryan Miller was a 45-year-old man whose wife had died and he hadn't been home in 2 whole weeks. 18 months ago his wife had died suddenly just like that with no warning at all. And he did what broken men do when grief becomes so unbearable you can't stand it. He ran away, not physically running away but emotionally running away. He disappeared from his sons' lives. He hired nannies to raise his 3-year-old triplets whose names were Tyler, Tommy, and Trevor. He worked all the time constantly, traveled endlessly to different places, convinced himself that providing money and things was the same as being present and actually there. But deep down inside his heart he knew the real truth. His sons barely recognized him anymore because he was never around. It was a cold October night when he came home 3 days early from a business trip to London with no warning and no phone call to let anyone know. The house was totally quiet when he walked in just after 9 o'clock at night. Everything was in its place looking perfect but feeling empty. And then he heard it. Laughter. Wild and uncontrolled laughter coming from the kitchen. His heart stopped beating for a second. The boys were supposed to be asleep in their beds because routines were sacred and very important. But this wasn't part of the routine at all. Ryan followed the sound of laughter with his shoes squeaking on the shiny floor until he reached the kitchen door, and when he pushed it open everything stopped. Hannah Carter, the housekeeper he had hired 6 months ago, was standing at his kitchen sink with all 3 of his sons inside it. There was water everywhere, bubbles everywhere. And they were laughing like he hadn't heard them laugh since their mother died. For a moment Ryan couldn't even breathe because Tommy, the one who screamed during every single bath, was actually giggling, and this woman, this stranger he barely knew, was doing something he had completely forgotten how to do. She was making them feel safe. Ryan stood frozen in that doorway watching his sons come alive in someone else's hands. And for the first time in 18 long months he felt something crack open inside his chest, something between grief and hope. Sometimes God uses the most unexpected people to remind us what love really looks like. 2 hours earlier Hannah Carter stood in the kitchen with her phone pressed against her ear trying very hard not to cry. Her baby brother's voice was shaking on the other end of the phone. He was excited and scared and hopeful all at once. He said, "Hannah, I got in. I actually got into college." Hannah whispered while gripping the counter, "That's amazing, Marcus. I'm so proud of you." But Marcus said, "The tuition and the books. I don't know how I'm going to pay for it all." Hannah cut him off even though her stomach twisted into knots and she said, "Don't worry about that, we'll figure it out. We always do." When she hung up the phone she stood there for a long moment staring at nothing. Marcus was 18 years old and the first person in their entire family to get into college, and Hannah had no idea how she was going to help him pay for it. Hannah was 30 years old and the oldest of 6 kids. She was raised in a cramped apartment on Chicago's South Side where her mama worked night shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. Hannah had been the one who made sure her brothers and sisters got to school every day, the one who cooked dinner, the one who stayed up when they were scared of the dark. She had dreams once about becoming a teacher or maybe doing something that mattered, but bills don't wait for dreams to come true. So when this job came up 6 months ago with good pay and room and board working for some tech billionaire in Connecticut, she took it without thinking twice. She was supposed to clean the house and stay out of the way. They said backup childcare occasionally, but occasionally turned into every single night because the nannies Mr. Miller hired didn't really care about those boys. Not really. They followed schedules and kept things quiet and made sure the house stayed perfect. But Tyler and Tommy and Trevor, they weren't perfect, they were sad. And Hannah knew exactly what sad looked like in a child's eyes. Hannah heard a small voice say her name. She turned around and Tommy was standing in the doorway in his pajamas clutching his stuffed bear with tears streaming down his face. Hannah knelt down and said, "Hey baby, what's wrong?" Tommy whispered that Miss Angela left, and she said she's not coming back. Hannah's jaw tightened because that was another one. That was the 3rd nanny this month who had quit. Tommy said, "And it's bath time." His voice cracked when he said it. He said, "I don't want to go upstairs." Hannah's heart broke into pieces. Tommy had slipped in the big bathtub 2 months ago and hit his head hard. Ever since then he screamed every single time they tried to bathe him up there in that bathroom. The nannies would force him anyway, holding him down while he cried and saying it was for his own good. Hannah hated it so much, she pulled Tommy close and said, "Come here." She felt his little body shake, then she said, "What? If we don't use the big tub tonight?" Tommy looked up at her confused. He started to say, "But Mr. Miller says," but Hannah said gently that Mr. Miller wasn't here right now. She said, "And you know what? I think we can make bath time fun." She asked, "Do you trust me?" Tommy nodded his head yes. 10 minutes later all 3 boys were in the kitchen sink. Hannah had filled it with warm water and bubbles. She rolled up her sleeves and put on some old Motown song her mama used to sing, and she turned the whole thing into a game. Tyler wanted a bubble beard, Trevor wanted to be a sea captain, and Tommy was laughing, actually laughing for real. Hannah stood there with her hands in the water singing and making up silly voices and watching these 3 little boys forget just for a moment that they were sad. And that's when the door opened. That's when Ryan Miller walked in. That's when Hannah's whole world stopped. Because the look on his face wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was grief. For a moment nobody moved at all. Hannah stood frozen at the sink with water dripping from her hands. The boys turned toward the doorway with their eyes wide. Tyler said "Daddy" at first, then all 3 of them scrambled out of the sink soaking wet and ran straight to him. Ryan dropped to his knees without thinking and caught them as they crashed into him. Their wet pajamas soaked through his expensive suit, but he didn't care at all. He wrapped his arms around all 3 at once, holding them tighter than he had in months. He whispered, "I miss you." His voice was rough. Trevor said, "You're home early," and then asked, "Are you staying?" Ryan hesitated and then said, "Yeah, I'm staying." Tommy tugged on his sleeve and said, "Can you read the jungle story? Hannah tells it every night. There's a lion and a moon and—" But Hannah's voice cut through gently. She was drying her hands on a towel and not quite meeting Ryan's eyes. She said, Okay. Bath time's over. Let's get you boys into bed." Tyler protested and said, "But Daddy just got here." Hannah said kindly but firmly that Daddy will still be here in the morning. She said, "Come on, let's go." The boys groaned but obeyed her and trailed after her toward the stairs. Ryan stood up slowly watching them go. At the doorway Hannah paused and turned back. She said, "Mr. Miller." Her voice was steady but he could see tension in her shoulders. She said, "I can explain." Ryan said quietly that they would talk after the boys were asleep. He said, "Meet me in the study." Hannah nodded and disappeared down the hall. 30 minutes later Hannah knocked on the study door. Ryan said, "Come in." She stepped inside with her hair pulled back now and her shirt changed. She looked professional and guarded. Ryan was standing by the window looking out at the rain. He didn't turn around. He said, "The kitchen's sink." Hannah took a breath. She said, "Tommy is terrified of the bathtub upstairs. He slipped 2 months ago. Ever since then he screams every time we try to." Ryan interrupted and said, "So you put all 3 of them in my kitchen sink?" Hannah said yes. Ryan finally turned around and his face was unreadable. He said, "That's not protocol." Hannah said, "No, it's not." Ryan said, "The nannies I hire follow specific procedures. There are bathrooms upstairs for a reason." Hannah met his gaze and said with respect, "Mr. Miller, your procedures were making your son cry himself to sleep every night." The words hung in the air. Ryan's jaw tightened. He said, "You're saying I don't know what's best for my own children." Hannah said, "I'm saying Tommy needed to feel safe." Her voice softened. And she said, "And in that kitchen with me right there he did." For the first time in weeks, Ryan stared at her, and for just a second something in his expression cracked. Hannah asked quietly, "When's the last time you gave them a bath?" The question landed like a punch. Ryan looked away. He said, "I provide them with everything they need." Hannah said, "Everything except you." There was silence. Ryan walked to his desk gripping the edge of it, and his knuckles went white. He said in a low voice, "You don't know what it's like to look at them and see her, to feel like every time you try you're just failing." Hannah's expression softened. She said, "Maybe. But they don't need you to be perfect, Mr. Miller. They just need you to be there." Ryan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again his voice was quieter and vulnerable. He said, "Show me." Hannah blinked surprised. Ryan said, "Tomorrow night show me what you do." Hannah asked, "You want to join bath time?" Ryan said, "I want to understand." Hannah nodded slowly and said, "Okay." As she turned to leave, Ryan called after her and said, "Miss Carter." She stopped. He said, "Thank you." He said, "For being there when I wasn't." Hannah looked back at him with something sad and hopeful in her eyes. She said, "They're waiting for you to be there too." And then she was gone. The next evening Ryan came home at 6 o'clock. The boys were in the kitchen with Hannah when he walked in. They looked up from their coloring books completely shocked. Trevor's crayon stopped moving in the middle of a stroke and he said, "Daddy, you're home." Ryan set his briefcase down, feeling awkward in his own house. He said, "I said I would be." He asked, "What are you guys doing?" Tyler held up a page covered in wild purple scribbles and said, "Look, it's a dinosaur." Ryan studied it and said, "That's very creative." Hannah glanced at him from the stove and said, "Dinner's almost ready, chicken nuggets and mac and cheese." Ryan asked, "Can I help?" Hannah paused, looking surprised, and then nodded. She said, "Sure. Can you cut up those apples, thin slices? Tommy won't eat them if they're chunky." Ryan moved to the counter and picked up the knife and started cutting. The slices were too thick. He tried again. Hannah said, "Gently thinner." She stepped beside him and said, "Like this." Her hand guided his for just a second and then she pulled back. Ryan muttered, "Got it." Tyler giggled and said, "Daddy doesn't know how to cook." Ryan said, "Then I guess I need to learn." Dinner was complete chaos. There was spilled milk, arguments over who got the blue plate, Tyler singing with his mouth full, Trevor dropping a nugget on the floor and picking it up to eat it anyway. Ryan watched Hannah handle it all with ease. She was redirecting and laughing and keeping things moving without ever raising her voice. He felt completely out of place, but he stayed. At 7:30 Hannah led the boys to the kitchen and announced bath time. Tommy's face fell. Hannah said, "In the sink again if that's okay with your dad." 3 pairs of eyes turned to Ryan. He cleared his throat and said, "Yeah, the sink's fine." Tommy's whole body relaxed. Hannah filled the sink with warm water and added bubbles and lifted Tommy in first. She said, "I'm right here, buddy." Tommy smiled. Ryan stood back watching and still feeling unsure. Hannah asked, "Want to help with Tyler?" Ryan stepped forward and Tyler looked up at him waiting. Ryan said, "Okay, let's get you in there." He lifted Tyler carefully like he might break. Hannah said, "Set him down in the bubbles next to Tommy." Tyler said, "It's warm, Daddy." Ryan said, "Good, that's good." Hannah handed him a washcloth and said, "Just wash his hair, make it fun." Ryan wet Tyler's hair and applied shampoo. His hands were clumsy and uncertain, and then by accident he made the soap stand up in a mohawk. Trevor burst out laughing and said, "Tyler looks like a punk rocker." Ryan blinked and then something loosened in his chest. He leaned into it and said, "Yeah, what about this?" He sculpted Tommy's hair into spikes. The boys dissolved into giggles. They shouted, "Do Trevor, do Trevor." Ryan made Trevor's hair stick straight up. All 3 boys were laughing so hard they could barely breathe. And Ryan, for the first time in 18 months, laughed with them. Really laughed. Hannah stepped back watching with a small smile on her face. This was what they needed, what he needed. After the boys were asleep, Ryan found Hannah cleaning the kitchen. Water was everywhere and towels were in a pile. He grabbed one and started drying the counter. Hannah said, "You don't have to." Ryan said, "I want to." They worked in silence for a moment. Then Ryan spoke and his voice was quiet. He said, "I haven't heard them laugh like that since my wife died." Hannah stopped wiping. She said, "They've been waiting for you." Ryan said, "I thought I was doing the right thing, giving them stability, the best of everything." Hannah said gently, "You were protecting yourself, but they don't need protection from you, they need you." Ryan set the towel down, and his throat felt tight. He said, "When it's just us, call me Ryan." Hannah looked at him and said, "Then call me Hannah." Something shifted between them. It was small and fragile but real. That night Ryan stood outside the boys' room listening to them sleep talk about Daddy's funny bubbles. His chest ached, but this time it didn't feel like grief. It felt like something growing. 2 weeks passed and Ryan came home every night by 6 o'clock, sometimes even earlier. He canceled trips and rescheduled meetings and told his assistant that his evenings were no longer negotiable. The boys noticed. They started running to the door when they heard his car. They started asking, "Is Daddy coming to dinner?" They started including him in their games. And Ryan, he started learning that Tommy needed his toast cut into triangles, that Tyler's stuffed elephant had to sit on the left side of his pillow, that Trevor hummed when he was thinking hard about something. These were small things, things a father should know. Hannah watched it all happen. She watched Ryan slowly come back to life. She watched the distance between him and his sons shrink a little more each day. And somewhere in the middle of bubble baths and bedtime stories, something else started happening, something neither of them said out loud. The way Ryan's hand would brush hers when they were folding laundry, the way Hannah would catch him looking at her across the kitchen, The way they would linger in the doorway after the boys fell asleep talking about nothing and everything, it scared her because she knew it couldn't last. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Hannah was in the garden with the boys when her phone rang. Her sister's name flashed on the screen. Hannah said, "Hey Maya, what's up?" Maya said, "Hannah, we need help." Hannah's stomach dropped, and she asked what happened. Maya said, "Marcus got into college, full acceptance, but we can't afford it, and Mama's hospital just sent another bill. We're 3 months behind on rent. I don't know what to do." Hannah closed her eyes. The boys were laughing behind her, chasing butterflies. She could hear their joy and their safety. Hannah asked, "How much do you need?" Maya said, 15,000 at least. Maya said, "Hannah, I'm sorry. I know you're doing everything you can, but..." Hannah said, "I'll figure it out." When she hung up, she stood there for a long time staring at nothing. $15,000, she did the math in her head. Her salary barely covered it. She would have to take a second job, which meant leaving Connecticut, which meant leaving them. That night Hannah was quiet during dinner. Tyler asked, tilting his head, "Are you sad, Hannah?" She forced a smile and said, "No baby, just tired." But Ryan saw through it. After the boys were asleep, he found her in the kitchen and asked, "What's wrong?" Hannah said, "Nothing, just family stuff." Ryan said, "Hannah." She looked up at him, and for a moment she almost told him, almost let herself lean on someone else for once. But then she remembered who he was and what she was. He was a billionaire, and she was the help. She said, "It's fine, I can handle it." Ryan didn't push, but the worry stayed in his eyes. Late that night Hannah sat at the small desk in her room above the garage. She pulled out a piece of paper and stared at it for a long time. Then she started writing. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Miller, it is with deep regret that I must resign my position effective 2 weeks from today." Her hand shook. She wrote, "This has been the most meaningful work of my life. Your sons will always hold a piece of my heart." Tears fell onto the paper. She wrote, "But my family needs me and I cannot be in 2 places at once." She signed it, and folded it, and left it on his desk before she could change her mind. The next morning Hannah went through the motions. She made breakfast and played with the boys and pretended her heart wasn't breaking. And at noon Ryan found the letter. He read it once, twice, 3 times. Then he sat down at his desk with the letter crumpled in his fist and realized something that terrified him. This wasn't just about the boys anymore. He needed her too. Ryan canceled his afternoon meetings. He sat in his study staring at Hannah's resignation letter and felt something inside him collapse. It said, effective 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks. 14 days before his sons lost the only person who had made them feel safe again. Before they went back to being quiet and withdrawn and alone. Before he lost. Ryan stopped himself, but the thought had already surfaced, and once it was there he couldn't push it back down. This wasn't just about the boys. He found her in the garden that afternoon. The boys were napping and Hannah was sitting on the bench under the oak tree staring at nothing. She didn't hear him approach. Ryan said, "Hannah." She turned startled and stood up quickly. She said, "Mr. Miller, I was just..." Ryan held up the letter and asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Hannah froze. Ryan said, "Your family, the money. Why didn't you say anything?" Hannah looked away and said, "Because it's not your problem." Ryan said, "Not my..." He stopped himself and took a breath. He said, "You're leaving because you need $15,000. Hannah said, "I'm leaving because my family needs me." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. She said, "My brother got into college. My mom was drowning in medical bills. I'm the oldest. This is what I do." Ryan said, "So you're just going to walk away from the boys, from..." He stopped. Hannah asked, "From what?" Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't. Because what was he supposed to say? That somewhere between bubble baths and midnight conversations she had become essential. That the thought of her leaving felt like losing his wife all over again. He had no right. He said, "Finally, they need you." Hannah's voice cracked when she said, "They need you more. You're their father, Ryan." "I'm just..." Ryan said, "Don't." The word came out harder than he meant. He said, "Don't say you're just anything." Hannah stared at him. Ryan said quietly, "You saved them." He said, "You saved me. And I'm not letting you walk away because you think you have to choose between your family and mine." Hannah asked, "What are you saying?" Ryan pulled an envelope from his jacket and said, "I made some calls this morning. Your brother's tuition is covered, all 4 years, room and board, books, everything." Hannah's hand went to her mouth. She said, "Ryan, I can't." Ryan said, "It's already done. Anonymous donation. His school doesn't even know it came from me." Hannah asked, "Why would you do that?" Ryan said, "Because I'm selfish." His voice was raw. He said because the thought of you leaving. He stopped and started again. He said because you gave my sons something I couldn't, joy and safety and love, and I'm asking you. Begging you to stay. Tears streamed down Hannah's face. Ryan continued and said not as an employee, he said as family. I want to make you their legal guardian. I want, his voice broke, he said I want you to stay. Hannah covered her face with her hands and her shoulders were shaking. Ryan took a step closer and said please. For a long moment she didn't move, then she looked up at him with tears still falling. She whispered okay, she said I'll stay. Ryan exhaled and relief flooded through him, but neither of them saw the car pulling through the gates. Neither of them knew that everything was about to get much harder. Saturday morning Ryan was in the kitchen with Hannah and the boys making pancakes. There was flour everywhere. Tyler's hands were covered in batter. Trevor was trying to flip one and nearly dropping it on the floor. There was laughter and warmth. The kind of morning Ryan never thought he would have again. Then the doorbell rang. Hannah looked up and asked were you expecting someone? Ryan frowned and said no. He walked to the front door wiping flour from his hands. When he opened it his blood went cold. He said Patricia. His wife's mother stood on the doorstep perfectly dressed with her eyes sharp as glass. She said hello Ryan. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She said I was in the area, thought I'd visit my grandsons. Ryan's jaw tightened and he said you should have called. Patricia said should I need permission to see my own family. She walked past him toward the kitchen with her heels clicking on the floor, and when she stepped into the kitchen doorway she stopped. Ryan was wearing an apron. Hannah was at the stove. The boys were covered in flour giggling on the counter. Patricia's expression didn't change but her eyes said everything. The rest of the morning was unbearable. Patricia stayed and watched everything. She criticized the boys' table manners. She mentioned how Ryan's wife would have handled things differently. She asked pointed questions about Hannah's responsibilities. Hannah stayed quiet and professional but Ryan could see her pulling back and building walls. That evening after the boys were in bed Patricia cornered Ryan in his study. She said we need to talk. Ryan closed his laptop and asked about what. Patricia said about her. Ryan said her name is Hannah. Patricia's eyes narrowed. She said I'm aware. I'm also aware that she's become far too comfortable in this house. The boys cling to her Ryan. It's inappropriate. Ryan said she's good for them. Patricia said or she's creating a dependency that will devastate them when she leaves. Because people like her always leave. Ryan stood up and said what's that supposed to mean? Patricia said you know exactly what it means. Her voice was cold. She said she's the help Ryan. Let's not pretend this is something it isn't. You're a widower. You're vulnerable. And she's taking advantage of that. Ryan said that's not. Patricia interrupted and said what do you really know about her? Her background. Her intentions. Ryan said I know she loves my sons. Patricia said or she loves your money. She leaned forward. She said your wife has been gone barely 18 months and you're allowing some woman to insert herself into your children's lives, into your life. Think about what you're doing. In the hallway Hannah stood frozen. She had been bringing fresh towels for the guest room but when she heard her name she stopped. She heard the words people like her always leave. She heard she's the help. She heard taking advantage. The words cut deeper than anything she had felt in years, because part of her had started to believe she belonged here, that maybe she wasn't just the housekeeper, that maybe Ryan saw her as something more. But Patricia's voice was a mirror showing Hannah the truths she had been trying to ignore. She didn't belong in this world, she never would. Hannah set the towels on the hall table and walked away with her chest so tight she couldn't breathe. Inside the study Ryan's voice was low and firm. He said Hannah is staying as family. I'm making her the boys' legal guardian. Patricia's face went pale. She said you cannot be serious. Ryan said I've never been more serious about anything. Patricia said then you're a fool. She grabbed her purse and walked to the door and paused. She said this will end badly Ryan. And when it does don't say I didn't warn you. She left and Ryan sat alone in the silence with his chest heavy. He didn't know Hannah had heard. He didn't know the damage was already done. The next morning something was different. Hannah was in the kitchen when Ryan came down. She had breakfast ready. The boys were eating. Everything looked normal but it wasn't. Ryan said good morning. Hannah said good morning Mr. Miller. Her voice was polite and distant. Mr. Miller not Ryan. He felt the shift immediately like a door had closed between them. The rest of the day was the same. Hannah stayed professional, did her job, played with the boys. but there was a wall now. Something she had put up overnight that Ryan couldn't reach through. At dinner he tried. He said Hannah about yesterday, my mother-in-law. Hannah said it's fine. She didn't look at him. She said she has every right to be concerned about her grandchildren. Ryan said that's not what Hannah interrupted and said excuse me. I need to start their bath. She left the room before he could finish. That night Hannah stood at the kitchen sink, the same sink where everything had started, and felt her heart breaking. She had been foolish, so foolish. For 2 weeks she had let herself believe in something that didn't exist, that she could be part of this family, that Ryan saw her as more than just a help. But Patricia's words had torn that illusion apart. She heard in her head, she's the help, Ryan. Let's not pretend this is something it isn't. Hannah looked down at her hands in the soapy water and realized the truth. No matter how much the boys loved her, no matter how much she had started to feel at home here, she would never truly belong, not in this world, not in his world. Upstairs the boys sensed it too. Tommy whispered to Ryan during story time and asked, why is Hannah sad? Ryan said, I don't know, buddy. Trevor asked, did we do something wrong? Ryan said, no, you didn't do anything wrong. But Trevor climbed into Ryan's lap looking up at him with worried eyes and asked, is Hannah leaving? Ryan's throat tightened and he said, no, she's not leaving. Trevor asked, promise? Ryan said, I promise. But even as he said it, Ryan felt the lie in his chest, because something had changed and he didn't know how to fix it. Late that night Ryan stood outside Hannah's door above the garage. He raised his hand to knock and then stopped. What could he say? That he defended her to Patricia. That didn't erase the words Hannah must have heard. That didn't change the reality of who they were. A billionaire and his housekeeper. Two different worlds that had collided for a moment but were never meant to stay together. Ryan lowered his hand and walked back to the house. Alone. And neither of them slept that night, both staring at the ceiling in separate rooms, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on their chests. Hannah thought about leaving again, packing her bags, disappearing before this hurt any worse. Ryan thought about how empty the house would feel without her, how quiet the boys would become, how much he had come to need her presence in ways he couldn't admit. And outside the night stretched on, cold and dark and heavy with the kind of silence that comes right before everything falls apart. Sunday afternoon Patricia insisted on hosting lunch. She said a proper meal with proper company. She invited a family from her country club. She set the table with fancy china. She made everything formal and cold. The boys sat quietly uncomfortable in their stiff clothes. Hannah was in the kitchen told to assist with serving. Ryan hated it, but he didn't know how to fight his mother-in-law without making things worse. Patricia served pasta. It was expensive and elegant and had shellfish in it. Hannah was clearing plates when she saw it. Her blood went cold. She stepped forward quickly and said, Mrs. Whitmore. She said, Tommy can't eat that. He's allergic to shellfish. Patricia waved her off and said, a little exposure builds immunity. My doctor friend told me so. Hannah said no firmly. She said, he's severely allergic. Please don't. Patricia said, I think I know what's best for my grandson. Hannah looked at Ryan and he was about to speak when Patricia cut him off. She said, Hannah, you're overstepping again. Hannah backed away with her hands shaking, and Tommy took a bite. 5 minutes later Tommy started scratching his throat. He said, Mommy. Then he stopped and looked confused. He said, Hannah, my throat feels weird. Hannah was at his side instantly. Hives were breaking out on his arms. His breathing was getting shallow. Ryan stood up and panic was rising. He said, Tommy, what's wrong? Hannah said, he's having an allergic reaction. Her voice was calm but her hands moved fast. She pulled an EpiPen from her apron pocket. She had been carrying it for months just in case. Patricia went pale and started to say, what are you? But Hannah didn't answer. She administered the injection steady and sure. Then she pulled out her phone. She said, this is Hannah Carter. I need an ambulance. 3-year-old boy, severe allergic reaction. EpiPen administered. Yes, he's breathing. We're at. Ryan couldn't move, couldn't think, he just watched Hannah hold Tommy, keeping him calm, whispering to him. She said, you're okay, baby, I've got you, just breathe with me, in and out. Tommy clung to her and said, Hannah, I'm scared. She said, I know, but you're safe. I promise. The ambulance came and Hannah rode with Tommy. Ryan followed with Tyler and Trevor. At the hospital the doctor pulled them aside and said, you saved his life. Another few minutes and this could have been much worse. Tommy was in a bed, recovering, and he wouldn't let go of Hannah's hand. Tyler and Trevor sat on either side of her, pressed close. Ryan stood in the doorway watching, and something inside him shattered. This woman his mother-in-law had called the help, had been prepared, had carried an EpiPen for months against everyone's advice, had known his son better than anyone, had saved his life. Patricia appeared beside him with her face pale with guilt. She looked at Hannah holding Tommy, and at the way all three boys clung to her. Patricia whispered, "I was wrong." Ryan didn't respond because he was done listening to anyone's opinion about Hannah. Later in the hospital cafeteria, Ryan sat across from Hannah. She looked exhausted and shaken. He said quietly, "I found your resignation letter." Hannah looked down. Ryan said, "I'm not accepting it." Hannah said, "Your mother-in-law made it very clear where I stand." Ryan said, "I don't care what she thinks." He leaned forward. He said, "Hannah, you saved my son's life today. But more than that, you've been saving all of us since the day you got here." Tears filled her eyes. Ryan said, "Stay." He said, "Please, not because I'm asking you to. Because you want to. Because you're family." Hannah's voice broke and she said, "People like me don't belong in families like yours." Ryan said, "Then maybe I've been in the wrong family." He reached across the table and took her hand. He said, "Maybe the right family is the one you choose. The one that chooses you back." Hannah stared at him. With tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "I'm staying." And for the first time in days, Ryan breathed. 6 months later, spring came to Connecticut, bringing warmth. After a long winter, the Miller estate looked different now. There were toys scattered on the lawn, drawings taped to the fridge, laughter echoing through rooms that used to feel like a museum. Ryan had restructured everything. He came home by 5 every day. No weekend travel. No more running. The boys were different too. They were louder and happier and more alive. And Hannah, she was still there, not as the housekeeper, not as the help, as family. One evening Ryan stood in the kitchen doorway watching. Hannah was at the sink, the same sink where everything had started, giving the boys their bath. They were 4 now, still giggling, still splashing, still turning bath time into an adventure. But this time Ryan didn't just watch. He walked over and rolled up his sleeves and joined them. Trevor squealed and said, "Daddy, you're getting soaked." Ryan grinned and said, "That's the point, isn't it?" He made bubble beards on all 3 boys. Hannah caught his eye and smiled. And in that moment Ryan realized something. He had spent 18 months trying to control everything, trying to keep the grief at bay by staying busy, by keeping his distance, by doing everything the right way. But Hannah had shown him something different, that sometimes love means getting messy. It means breaking your own rules. It means showing up, even when you're scared of getting it wrong. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Ryan and Hannah sat on the back porch. The air was warm and the stars were out. Hannah said softly that Tyler drew another picture today. Ryan asked, "Yeah." Hannah said, 5 people this time. "You and me and the boys." She said, "He titled it My Family." Ryan's throat tightened and he asked, "Is that what we are?" Hannah looked at him and said, "I think so, don't you?" Ryan nodded and said, "Yeah, I think we are." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, then Hannah spoke quietly. She said, "You know what I think?" Ryan asked, "What?" Hannah said, "I think God knew exactly what he was doing, bringing me here, to this house, to your boys." She paused. "She said to you." Ryan reached over and took her hand. He said, "I think my wife would have liked you." Hannah said, "Yeah." Ryan said, "Yeah." He said, "She always said the best things in life come when you're not looking for them. When you stop trying to control everything and just let grace in." Hannah smiled with tears in her eyes and said, "Grace." She said, "That's ironic." Ryan said, "Maybe. Or maybe it's exactly how it was supposed to be." The next morning Ryan came downstairs to find chaos in the kitchen. Hannah was making pancakes with the boys. There was flour everywhere, batter on the counters, music playing. It was a pure beautiful mess. Hannah looked up and caught him watching and she laughed. She said, "Don't just stand there, we need help." Ryan walked over and as he stepped into the noise and the laughter and the mess, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt complete, not because everything was perfect but because everyone he loved was right there, present, laughing together. That evening Patricia called and asked, "How are my grandsons?" Her voice was softer than it used to be. Ryan said, "They're good, they're happy." There was a pause and then Patricia said, "And Hannah, is she still there?" Ryan said, "She is." Patricia's voice cracked slightly when she said, "Good." She said, "That's good, Ryan." She said, "Your wife would be proud of you." When Ryan hung up, he stood there for a moment letting those words settle. Then he walked into the living room where Hannah was reading to the boys. He sat down beside them. Tommy crawled into his lap. Tyler leaned against Hannah. Trevor sprawled across both of them. and Ryan closed his eyes listening to Hannah's voice, feeling his son's weight against him. And he whispered a prayer he hadn't prayed in months. He said thank you for second chances, for grace that shows up when you need it most, for family that finds you even when you've stopped looking, for love that heals, for coming home. Sometimes the people who save us aren't